Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Tom Titus, a research biologist at the University of Oregon's Institute of Neuroscience, where he works on fish genetics. Titus traveled to Antarctica in March 2012 to study ice fish. Titus is the current president of the Eugene Natural History Society. He's also an avid writer, runner, gardener, beekeeper, mushroom forager, and a general outdoorsman. He published his first book, Blackberries, in July, A Forager's Guide to Inner Peace, in 2012. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's really always a great pleasure to feature a writer who is also one of our academics. And I guess I'd like to start there. You are what our producer called a pretty serious science guy. And in fact, you speak about that a little bit in the book. How did a pretty serious science guy who does fish genetics end up writing a book about the natural environment in Oregon?
Oh, great question. Yeah, believe it or not, I started out as a music major, so I do have that creative side to me, and I think actually creativity is a little underrated in the sciences. It gets the creative mind gets used a lot more than people might generally realize. But at any rate, the book started when I bumped into a writer friend of mine, Jessica Maxwell, and we were on an airplane to Southern California, and Jessica and I were talking about her writing, and she, at the end of, getting toward the end of that trip, said, "Do you have a book in you?" She asked me that question, and I said, "Oh, I don't know. What about this?" And I sort of abstracted this idea that I had about a set of stories having to do with coming home to Oregon, because I just recently returned to Oregon from St. Louis, where I was on a postdoc. And she said, "Well, that just sounds great." So I spent 4 days sitting by the pool at my in-laws' place in Southern California outlining this book. So that's how the whole process started. It's an interesting transition to make from academic writing to more creative, artistic writing. And the book is memoir. It's creative nonfiction, and I think there were multiple processes going on here at the same time. One, I had just recently come home. It was a big career move for me to come back to Oregon. There were career sacrifices that I needed to make that I hadn't really considered up until that point. So there was a coming home piece to it. The other part was learning how to be multiple people at one time during the writing process. And so part of me was still a scientist, and that's my day job now. I continue to do research, and so there was the science side. There was the part of me that the creative side. And then there was this really emotional part where I was coming home and trying to re-anchor myself in my place. And going through that process was amazing. In my early writing, I had a wonderful person in my writers group, Yvonne Young, who's a professional storyteller. And Yvonne knows voice. She knows how to use voice. And in the earlier writing, Yvonne would look at me, and bless her heart, she would say, there are at least two very distinct voices here. And she could identify that creative musician side of me right away, but she said, and then you shift here and you become, I like to call him Mr. Science, and the writing just changes completely. So the challenge over time was, and some people like that, they like that in their prose, they like switching back and forth. And at some point I made the decision to try and unify those two voices. And that was fascinating, actually. I went from, I had to move between the two different writing styles, choose which one I wanted, and obviously I wanted the artistic musical side, but I wanted to get the science piece in there as well. And so I would look back at what I had written before and then look at the science voice and say, okay, how can I meld those two? How can I think about those things in a unified way? And it's interesting, the creative process. There's some neurobiology there and neuroscience there to support this idea that you focus on a problem, and in this case the focus was the scientific part of the writing, and then once you've focused very intently on that, you know what you want to do with it, then you step back and you let it go. You just walk away from it. And then you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, I know how I'm going to write that. So.
In another conversation we had before this interview, you described what it would be like for Mr. Science to describe a salmon, and then you take Mr. Science's prose and turn it into an artistic piece of lovely language, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was interesting. I had a paragraph describing the biology of coho salmon, and normally I'm a slow writer. It takes me quite a while to get the prose out the way I like it. But in this particular case, I wrote this paragraph in 10 minutes. And it was Mr. Science. That was Mr. Science's voice. And I read that and I thought, wow, all the information's there, but that's really horrible. And so how do you make that an artistic piece of writing? It's a challenge, but it's been a fun one to embrace.
The title, the significance of the title didn't fully come home to me until I read the book and read Blackberries in July, the chapter called Blackberries in July, which is mid-book because it follows the annual cycle. And you make sure I get this right, but what I understood was that those July blackberries are the rarer, harder ones to find. They're the wild blackberry that is smaller but all the more intense and very much a prize, but you have to work hard to get them. It seemed to me like it was a good metaphor for the book. What do you think?
Oh, it's a great metaphor for the book, because the book really all is completely about anchoring ourselves in our place. And I think that any knowledge that we have that's special to our place helps us to do that. And there aren't many people if you were to go out and poll people in Eugene and ask them about what they know about blackberries, they would describe that great, big, juicy, beautiful, they're actually called Armenian blackberries. We grew up calling them Himalayan blackberries, but that's the blackberry they would describe. They wouldn't know about our native wild blackberry. It's the dewberry, or the trailing blackberry, some people call it. So it really is that one of those pieces of special knowledge, and the fact that you do have to go out and spend the time and be into the process as opposed to an outcome, I think is really important. It is a great metaphor for the book.
I was very much taken by your language. You are a very skilled nature writer, and there's a lot of beauty in the language. I'm wondering if you were also the poet who produced the poems at the beginning of some of the chapters.
I am, yeah.
I see. Okay, so maybe we can hope for a chapbook somewhere down the line as well.
It's on my list.
Oh, good. I'm very glad to hear that.
Thank you for saying so.
Well, I read the poems and they were so tightly integrated with the prose around them that I thought you must be the author, but you don't actually attribute them one way or the other, so it was worth checking. I'd like to get you to read, if you would be willing, so that our listeners can hear some of this lovely prose in your own voice. And while you get set up and choose your passage, I'm going to hold the book up to the camera so we can get a good look at it. Would you be willing to read?
I'd love to read.
Great. Okay, so here is your beautiful book, and you've got your own copy to read from, right? Yeah. Okay, well, take your time and get set up, and I'm curious to know which passage you picked. I have my favorites, but I bet you have your favorites too. What are we going to hear, or are you going to surprise us?
So, this chapter, I'm going to read a little excerpt from a chapter called Chanterelle Forest, and just a 1 minute backstory. This was a mushroom hunt, and I went out there right after a presidential election that I didn't end up very happy about.
We won't ask you to specify which one. Okay.
In addition to my daughter was having a slumber party at home, and this was going to be an overnight affair, and so Kim, my wife, gently nudged me out the door. She said, "Be gone." So I was gone. And I went out into the forest, and I went mushroom hunting, and I came home and I wrote about it.
Great.
And so this is a passage, I think, that encapsulates perhaps how we might feel when we really go out and embrace our place and embrace the natural world. It's a complex process, and I'll let you think on it as I read. That thing lurking around the edges of my morning now steps fully and deliberately into the open. I realize that I am angry, not just PO'd, angry to the basement bottom of my soul. I am angry for every road-scarred clear cut and for every baby coho choked on silt and every gallon of herbicide ever sprayed for every 2x4 I ever bought. Angry for every dam that blocked a river and every salmon that would never die at home and for every kilowatt of hydropower I ever used. Angry for the rock mined from river bottoms and every mile of every road I ever drove on that gravel. Angry for no taste, no name, no story, no soul petrochemical food and every plastic package of it I ever ate. Angry for smoggy skies obscuring the gold-smattered hills of autumn, and for every piece of wood I ever burned to heat my house. Angry for economics and economists and every living thing that has died in the name of a sound economic decision, and for my own retirement account. Angry for every politician and every corporate lobbyist who paid them to doom the biosphere to a long, slow death, and for every time I was suckered into voting for one of them. Angry for every person sitting on every street corner begging for my money, and for every time I turned my back. Angry that I am picking mushrooms in this peaceful forest, standing here in my anger, and thinking that if I were to focus all this angry energy, it would cause me to self-combust, and I would be immolated in a pillar of chanterelle orange flame. But anger is the eruption on the surface, a secondary emotion caused by something molten deep within. I become still and begin to follow the path of my breathing inward, allowing this little grove of old growth to fuel my imagination, carrying me back 1,000 years before all the logging and road building and planting and herbicides and thinning that now collectively pass for intensive forest management, returning to a time when old forests dominated the land, embracing it in an enduring state of ecological climax, a time when salmon and spotted owls and salamanders were never in the news, when tree sitting was a rest stop for undomesticated humans who traveled the dim vastness. We are wounded in our isolation. Millions of years of evolution have etched into our chromosomes a deep need for deep connections to the land and other people that is as immutable as the rocks that have become our bones that carry us around in this green world. So we arrive at a profound and tragic paradox. We must throw open the windows, break out of our cubicle, trade recycled air for oxygen made by real trees, give up hard black asphalt for delicate green moss, dump the vitamin pills, and forage for wild mushrooms. We must travel further along the path toward intimacy with the land. But in doing these things, we will be hurt. We will be traumatized. Despite this risk, I choose the path of reconciliation. I accept that I will be damaged, but I will not be destroyed by my wounded anger. Instead, I will forgive. I forgive because I must. Because if I don't, then upon my re-entry into the atmosphere of the living world, I will be obliterated in the fire of my own resentment. Instead, I choose twisted vine maple and forgiveness, slanting autumn sun and shadows on sword fern and forgiveness, a gentle trickle of spring water over sandstone and forgiveness, a young hemlock tree growing from a sawed-off stump, and forgiveness, the soft silence of an owl's feathers, and cool salamander skin, and the tiny hot breath of a winter wren chattering in the sallow, and forgiveness. I choose to forgive self-centered human blundering and insensitivity, especially my own, even though I do not forgive easily. I choose my wife and children and friends and forgiveness. I choose to watch the landscape heal. I choose to heal myself.
Thank you. What a wonderful passage from near the end of the book, yes?
Yeah.
Tom, this struck me when I read that chapter. It strikes me even more forcefully hearing you read it. You're a very compelling voice for your own prose. That there's a mix of a whole number of different genres in this book. This is not only nature writing, there's also spirituality, there is philosophy, and there's a very personal narrative in here as well, which you make clear right from the outset. Did you have any hesitations about being quite so revealing of your own story in this?
Yes.
In a word?
In a word, I did. And I still perhaps do, a little bit. It's in the book, of course, but that career transformation that I had to make, and there were a lot of sacrifices involved in that, and that was not something that came easily or overnight. I laugh about it sometimes, but the book, What Color is Your Parachute? About career change, and I tell people mine was black, and it didn't open until I hit the ground and bounced. So it was a tough time, But the reason that the book needed to come to be was in large part because I just found this out in the past year. I needed to write this book to give myself permission to have made those decisions and to be here. So life's a trade-off, and that was one I was willing to make.
You've gone quite public with it now. It's been out for a little while. You're giving readings. You've had some press. We're doing this interview. So I imagine that that kind of revelation can be painful. You also include descriptions of your family and the roles they play in your life. What about your children? Are they going to follow in your footsteps, do you think, as being deeply, deeply invested in the natural environment here?
I have two kids. Both of them are grown now. We're empty nesters here as of just in the past couple of years.
It's Alex and Laurel, correct?
Alex and Laurel, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Laurel, my daughter, definitely has that piece. She loves tradition, and she loves to be home and doing the things that we used to do when she was here all the time. And she's read the book, and she went, oh, cider pressing. I just really want to go cider pressing. Well, Laurel's now a recruiter for a company that recruits IT people in San Francisco. So she loves San Francisco too, and I don't know when she'll come back. I think someday she will. My son, he's a little less tied to his past. He doesn't have encumbrances so much. So I don't really know how that's going to go for either of them. I'd love to have them home. Well, not home, but somewhere closer.
In the larger home.
Yeah.
One of the things that is really evident in your book is the element of water that is so dominant in this landscape, whether it's running in rivers or falling on us. You have a just really lyrical, poetic descriptions of rain. I was really struck by some of them. 2 weeks before the summer solstice, cold rain falls like an unshakable bad habit. Gray runoff sluicing down the gutter along our suburban street. You've obviously made peace with that part of our climate.
Yeah. Yes, I have. And that's not an easy thing to do necessarily, even for people who have been here a long time. I remember coming back from Kansas, or from St. Louis, sorry, and the first 2 years we were back were those 2 years where we had 100 inch plus rain years. broke the rain gauge out at the airport, I think. And I used to wake up in the morning and look out the sliding glass door into the backyard and say, damn, it rains a lot around here. But winter's a time for reflection, and I've made my peace with that. It really is a time to sit back and take it easy, because this kind of lifestyle requires a tremendous amount of energy, and it's nice during the winter when things are settled and quiet and there's a lot going on to go, okay.
Yeah. Let me ask you a humanist's question. I can see why your background and your manner of thinking, your ways of thinking as a scientist, heavily influence the accuracy, the detail, the vivid pictures you draw of the Oregon landscape and flora and fauna. Does your humanist poet writer side influence the way you do science?
I don't think so. I think what influences the way I do science is an ability to think laterally and make connections between things. And if I have a gift, and I don't consider myself a particularly gifted person, but if I have a gift, it's to engage in that kind of thinking and to move back and forth between things. And I think that's why I've been relatively successful at unifying my voice, for example, in the book. But science is it's a different gig, and I have to laugh. I think poets and artists tend to understand that we're all talking about the same world, and we might all be talking about the same kinds of things. I'm not sure the scientists get it quite yet.
That was an implicit part of my question, I think. Yes, absolutely. I want to just broaden, because you do a really wide variety of things, and you're in different worlds all the time, a foot in each. You say early on that you're addicted to discovery, and I think that's the piece that drives you to scientific investigation, I would think. It took you to the Antarctic. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about that journey? That your photographs and your narrative from that trip came to my attention at the same time as your book did. So for me, they're two pieces of a puzzle here. How do you see that?
Yeah. So the trip to the Antarctica was a research trip, and we, as part of many things that we do in our lab, study bone loss disease. And we studied a group of fishes that live down there, the ice fish, that have gotten rid of most of the mineralized parts of their bones. So that's what makes your bones nice and strong, and it also makes them heavy. And so they've lightened things up a little bit. The interesting thing is their bones look just like a person who has really severe osteoporosis. So we've adopted them as a model for studying the genetics of osteoporosis. So that's the science part of it. So we went down there to get fish, and I won't bore you with all those details. The trip was amazing. I was blown away by Antarctica and just the stark beauty of the place. It was incredible. But I don't know if I've ever felt further from home. You know, this is my place. And in fact, I came back from that trip and wrote an essay about it called "There's No Place Like Home." And there really isn't. I was very thrilled to get home. I was incredibly seasick. You probably remember that from the writing.
Yes, I do. I gather that was a major feature of your time down there.
Certainly getting there it was, yeah.
Yeah. Could you imagine yourself writing a book analogous to this one about a landscape as different from Oregon? Could you immerse yourself in it enough to do it somewhere else?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. You know, I think that I could. I think it might take some time. So to use Antarctica as an example, one thing that I say, you know, that some people need 50 different ways to describe snow. We need 50 different ways to describe rain. And in Antarctica, you need 50 different ways to describe ice. And you become over time tuned into the nuance of ice. And it's subtle, but it's there. And it's not as multidimensional as what we have here, for example, where we have multiple shades of green and layers of canopy in the forest. It's very almost two-dimensional in that regard, but blues and whites and grays are what you get. And I think it's possible that I could bury myself in that and come up with some sort of a creative enterprise.
Is it appealing to you as a project?
No. I love this place.
I get it. It would mean spending a lot of time away from home.
Yeah.
So my question for you, Tom, and this might be our last one, is do you have another book in you, Tom Titus?
I do.
You
yes.
do?
Yeah.
Are you willing to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. In fact, I talked about it for too long with Kim this morning, and I was late for work.
Can you give us a hint of what we might expect?
I certainly have another set of what could be construed as essays in me. In fact, probably several of them are already written. So that's an obvious next book. And there's some verse in here, as you mentioned early on. So I've really become enamored with poetry, which surprises me because I've not considered myself a poet either. And I would like to do a small book of poetry as well. So those are two projects that are on the near horizon. I'll have to come clean. This one took me 13 years to write. I had a lot to learn. It's not going to take 13 years to finish the next one. And then I'll just have to think about it some more. But I love this style. It suits me, and it suits my attention span, I think.
And you've obviously developed a set of practices and disciplines that allows you to write at the same time as you hold a really demanding day job, so you can foresee maintaining those rhythms?
Yeah. I write generally in the morning. That's my creative time. I can do less demanding things in the evening, but and I'm an early morning person, so that works out well for me.
Well, I hope it doesn't take you 13 years, because I will want to invite you back the minute the next one is out, whether it's that poetry volume or another book of essays like this. And I congratulate you. It is a fabulous book.
Thank you very much.
It's very meaningful, I think, for all of us who hold Oregon flora and fauna dear. So many thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Tom Titus, a research biologist at the University of Oregon's Institute of Neuroscience. He is the author of Blackberries in July, A Forager's Guide to Inner Peace. It was published in 2012. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.